Hey guys, Justin here with JHart Modelworks, and in this part of the build for the Gordon Murray Automotive T.50 by Tamiya, we're going to knock out the rear suspension, we're going to finish up the rest of the interior, and we're going to start on the upper chassis. So let's go ahead and get the camera flipped around and get to work. And we are starting out this video by attempting to replicate the Alcantara section of the dashboard. Now I've only tried using this method once before, so I'm still learning this as we go. The process is going to be very similar to flocking, but we're going to be using glass microspheres instead of flock or embossing powder. So I've gone ahead and primed these parts in some Mr. Surfacer 1500 gray. This way, if this goes terribly wrong, I can just toss it in some IPA and it'll strip off the primer and the adhesive and spheres will come right off with it. So the first thing we want to do is assemble these two parts of the dash so they can be treated and painted as one piece. We'll just add some Tamiya extra thin and fit the parts together. It is important to make sure that you are out of frame when you do this. We'll need to fiddle with these just a bit to get them lined up so that they glue together correctly. And then we'll just run another bead of Tamiya extra thin along the inside for good measure. Once dry, we've masked off a few spots that we want to remain clean and smooth. These are areas where other parts are going to glue into place and we don't want the microspheres getting in the way of fitment. We want to make sure we use an old brush, don't use our good brush for this, and we're going to be using some Mod Podge. I'm going with a matte finish, but I don't think it really matters. We're going to spoon a little bit of the Mod Podge into a container. I get this milk that comes in these glass jars, and the big plastic lids are really good for this. I'm also going to add just a little bit of water and stir it in to thin this down. We want it nice and thin enough for it to lay down smooth, but still thick enough to be adhesive and stick when it dries. And for the last ingredient, we're going to be using some glass microspheres. I got this huge tub a long time ago on Amazon. I have no idea how much I paid for it. I will have these forever. We want to brush on a thin layer of our Mod Podge onto the part, nice and thin and hopefully smooth. I should have masked off these little corner winglets. We don't want to get anything on those. Now there is a panel line here that marks the separation between the dash and the door panel. Before the glue has a chance to dry, we want to quickly and carefully run the back of a hobby knife through the panel line to clean it out. Next, we're going to cover the part with the microspheres. We will then tap off the excess, and that will leave us with our texture. So we do still have some spheres in the panel lines, but it's easier to see since we cleaned them out the first time. So we're once again going to drag the hobby knife along the panel line, being very careful not to touch the part and mess up the surface, just to clean out and redefine that line again. Once this side dries, we'll repeat that process on the other side and then we'll head into the spray booth. Here we are in the spray booth. We've removed our masking and we're going to start with a couple of light coats of Mr. Surfacer 1500 black primer. Partially because I remember that I used black primer when I did the interior and I want to make sure that the gray on this dash will match up with the gray in the seats. But we also want to make sure we have a primer coat over the spheres for paint adhesion and to ensure we have an even base color between the part surface and the spheres so it doesn't affect our paint color. Speaking of our paint color, once the primer is dried, we're going to follow that up with a few light coats of Tamiya LP13 Imperial Japanese Navy Gray. This is the same gray we used on the lower interior. While we're at it, we're also going to paint up these little side monitors as well. Full disclosure, these are not the kit parts. I had to 3D model and print some of these as I lost one of the kit parts somewhere. I have no idea where. Realistically, they're really just a couple of rectangles. After a few coats of our gray, we're going to hit this with a couple of coats of Mr. Hobby GX113 UV cut flat clear to give us a nice flat finish. I've been using this a lot lately. I'm really liking this UV cut clear. The GX113 is the flat and the 112 is the high gloss. I cut the 112 with Mr. Leveling Thinner, but for the flat I use Mr. Rapid Thinner. 50/50, it gives us a great finish. Okay, so this is the end result. It's not perfect. This is again only the second time trying these, and I'm trying to figure out the best way to use them. We have a little more texture than I would like, and more than it appeared when we first applied the microspheres. I think when I sprayed the primer in the paint, the lacquer thinners had a reaction with the Mod Podge, causing the extra texture. So when I try this again sometime, I may try applying the spheres directly to a wet coat of primer instead of using the glue layer. Before we begin assembling, we want to take care of a little bit of detail painting and some decals. We're going to start with some Vallejo silver, and with our mechanical pencil, we're just going to take care of the center of the steering wheel spokes. And we'll clean up any excess with some UMP airbrush cleaner on a cotton bud. Now with the steering wheel spokes painted up, we're going to move on to the center decal. With an optimizer on, you can see it reads V12, so we're going to remove the excess moisture and work to get that set in place and facing the right direction with some microset. If you recall, during the lower interior portion a couple of videos ago, we made the pull straps for the glove boxes instead of using the orange decals from Tamiya. We're going to repurpose one of those decals for a 12 o'clock stripe on the top of the steering wheel. When we first apply it, it won't take the shape of the wheel as well as I had hoped. I tried to apply some UMP strong decal solution, which knocked the stripe off onto my finger, but once I placed it again with the UMP solution, it dropped right into place and wrapped right around the wheel. For the door cards, Tamiya have given us some nice silvery speaker mesh grille decals. We'll apply those with some microset, and we're using a silicone brush here to set that in place. I find these silicone brushes have just enough grip to help slide the decal around with less chance of tearing them than using a sharp pair of tweezers. Now surprisingly, for how flat this decal is, I had a little bit of difficulty with the edges, so I went ahead and hit them with some microsol and let that soften them up, and they laid down into place. We have 3 more interior decals to place. These go on the instrument cluster. There's actually 2 that go on the little side monitors, but they're just black squares, and I already masked them off, so mine are already black. So we're going to go ahead and skip those. Then, moving on to the chassis and suspension parts, we're going to apply our brake logos. We also have two more decals that go on the small side panels. These panels sit just behind the side windows under the engine bay covers. In hindsight, I probably should have painted these parts to match the carbon, but once I had the decals in place, it was just too late. I can't mask over the decals without removing the decals with the masking tape. Now this one for the fuel cap was an absolute pain. It's incredibly small, so it's hard to see if it's facing the right direction, and it keeps wanting to slide around when I touch it with the cotton bud to try and remove the excess moisture and press it down, but we do finally get it into place. Okay, time to start assembly. The way Tamiya wants you to do this is they want you to install the engine subassembly into the interior chassis assembly first. They then want you to assemble and install the rear shocks onto the mount points here with the engine in the way. Instead, I'm going to attempt to install the shocks first and then set the engine assembly into place. First, we want to take our spring and mount it onto the cylinder-shaped part of the rear shock. This is the outer shock with the hole in it. We will then slide the inner post portion of the shock into the hole and slide the parts together. I've used no glue at this point, which will allow us to adjust things as necessary later. Next, we will apply some glue to the two mounting holes on the chassis and position the shock assembly so that both pins drop into place and the end of the shock lines up with the mount point at the top center of the chassis. We'll then repeat the process for the other shock on the other side of the chassis. Now, I did have a little bit of trouble with this one getting it into place. I had to fiddle with it a bit more, but we did finally get it to sit where we want it. Now we're going to connect the engine section to the interior section of the chassis, and I'm going to do something a little odd here. I'm going to use Tamiya extra thin cement so that the two chassis plates will weld together to form a strong bond. But I'm also going to apply a little bit of CA glue in a couple of spots to give us a quick bond to hold the chassis together while the Tamiya sets. This way we don't have to worry that something flexed or got moved out of position while we were waiting on the Tamiya to take its time and set up. We're also going to apply some Tamiya extra thin to the 4 locating points that are on the inside of the engine plate. We then want to slide the engine assembly into place, making sure we don't hit the shocks, and we want to press the mount points together and hold them in place while the CA sets, especially these two rear trapezoidal shaped ones, as they kept wanting to pop out on me. That's the main reason why I used the CA glue. Now with the engine in place, the rear shocks are a little bit out of position, and because we didn't glue anything together, we can just nudge these into the right place. And then, even though it probably isn't necessary, I'm going to drop a little bit of CA glue onto the ends of the shock assemblies. And mounting these in first was a lot easier than my attempts to test fit them in with the engine bay in place. Moving on, we want to insert one of the large poly caps into our rear hubs. We'll apply some Tamiya extra thin to the mounting surface and to the inside of the poly cap cover, and then we'll set the poly cap cover into place. Now we want to add some CA glue to the mounting holes on the brake calipers and to the mount posts on the uprights and slide the calipers into place. We're going to add some CA glue to the mount point on the other side of the upright for the handbrakes. We'll then slot our rotor into place into the caliper with no glue. It does not get glued in. Then we'll set the handbrake part into place, and it should lock the rotor into place while allowing the rotor to spin freely in the brake assembly. With the brake assembly complete, we'll add a little glue to the back of the upright and slot in the rear axle. There is a locating tab at the top, so it has a nice positive fit. Then we'll add a little glue to the upper and lower mount points on the suspension and slide the uprights into place. Now I've watched others build this and they didn't seem to have the same issue that I did. My upright didn't want to seat all the way in without a little wiggling of the axle and pressure on the lower mount point to get it to set in place. Maybe I did something wrong, I don't know, but it does seem to have finally set in. And now we need to install these rear chassis supports. There are 3 glue points. One is on the side chassis part of the rear shock assembly, one is on the back end of the chassis pan, and the third one is under the rear radiator support. I found it easier to glue the first 2 points, set the first end into place on the shock support, tuck the other end under the exhaust but don't set it, then set the bottom into place on the chassis plate, then come back and set the end under the radiator. Again, test fit everything first. I've tried this 2 or 3 times before I figured out the best way to set this for me. We'll just go ahead and set the other side in place as well, and that's going to wrap up the lower chassis and suspension. From the rear suspension, we're going to move on to the upper interior. This is going to consist of the dashboard and the door cards. These are surprisingly complex, and yet once again, everything goes together really well. We're going to apply some CA glue to the 3 mount points on our gray dash we did the Alcantara on earlier, as well as on the corresponding points on this black inner part, and then fit it into place inside the dash. I contemplated doing this black part in the forged carbon as well, but as you'll see when we put it all together, I really like how the semi-gloss black breaks up all the forged carbon in this area. Next we'll add some glue to the top of only the sides of our gauge faces, and then fit it to the top of the instrument cluster. The circle center section of the gauge face sits in front of the top piece. If we put glue on that, we're just going to make a mess. Then we'll add some glue to the mount points on top of the dash and drop the instrument cluster into place. Now I went with the gloss black center and then I flanked it with our forged carbon on the sides. I think this gives it a really cool look. These next parts are freaking tiny. I kept them on a bit of the sprue until I was absolutely ready for them. On each side of the instrument cluster is a control pod with 3 knobs, and Tamiya felt it would be really cool to make the center knob a separate tiny part. One side of these tiny little parts is flat, and that part glues to the control pods. We'll add a little glue to the mount point and glue the center knob into place. Make sure you use the right one as the mounts are angled slightly and the wrong one won't fit right. Also try not to drop these because they are a nightmare to find. We'll assemble the other side the same way, and then we want to add a little bit of glue to the flat edge on the top and bottom of this black tailpiece. The side clusters will then slide right into place between the bottom of the instrument cluster and the top of the dash. This is why we masked this area off and didn't add the microspheres here. Also, check your fingers constantly for glue. You don't want to get glue on your fingers and accidentally rip off a chunk of the dash texture. Once these are in place, the dashboard looks like something out of a spaceship. Next up, we're going to assemble the steering wheel. We need to glue this back piece on. These look like paddle shifters. And this is a part on the real car, but the car has a gear shifter, and when they drive the car on the YouTube channel, they use the shift knob. Maybe these are the turn signals? I don't know. Anyway, I took some major liberties and I painted them anodized candy orange. On one of their videos, Gordon Murray was talking about speccing one of these cars, and he said there is no option list. This is a £3.5 million car, that's about $4.5 million US. If a buyer wants something and it can be done within reason, it'll be done at no additional cost. That's kind of cool. Ferrari would charge something stupid like another 10 grand just to change the color of the paddle shifters. With the steering wheel assembled, we'll then glue the steering wheel onto the steering column. Make sure the locating nub on the flat surface points up. We'll then add some glue to the bottom of the dash and we'll press the flat space on the column to the bottom of the dashboard. Now we want to attach these side monitors. Like I said earlier, I lost one of these, so I took some measurements off the remaining one. I 3D modeled a new set. We'll remove these from the supports, and then we're going to CA glue them into place on the dash as well. And that is the dash all wrapped up. From the dash, we want to move on to our door cards, and once again, I took a lot of liberties color-wise on the interior. We'll start by slotting these panel inserts into the door card, and then we'll glue it in place from the back with some CA glue. Next, we want to glue in our handle, and we want to make sure that the flat section in the back lays flat on the door card. The front will raise up away from the door card a little bit. That is okay, as this creates the locating point for connecting the door card to the dash. Once we have the other door card assembled, we will add some glue to the top of the panel here and the front of the handle, and we'll slot the door card into place on the side of the dash. If you remember, when we were doing the Alcantara, we cleaned out the panel line on the dash repeatedly to keep that line free of the microspheres. This line is the separation mark between the actual dash and the top front section of our door. And that is a wrap for the interior. We will come back to this in a bit though. We're moving on to some of the chassis assembly, and we're going to start by gluing this air scoop into the roof. There are a couple of small inset kind of trenches along the edge of the roof. We're going to go ahead and apply our CA glue into these trenches, very careful not to get it on any of the gloss black. Now the air scoop has two really shallow tabs that run along the bottom, and these drop into those trenches. This should be really simple. For me, for some reason, I just couldn't get this part to sit right. It kept wanting to go in at an angle for me, and I had to wiggle it around quite a bit. So be careful that you don't get any glue on anything while you're fiddling with this, if like me, you have trouble. Now we want to glue in these little triangular side pieces that sit back behind the windows. There's a couple of mount holes in here we're going to apply some CA glue to. We will then drop the part into place with those little locating tabs. And then once we get it in place, I'm going to add a little bit more CA glue along the top edge. And we'll repeat that process for a similar piece on the other side of the chassis. We have some kind of a reservoir here. We're going to go ahead and glue the cap onto it. I honestly have no idea what this part is for. Then we're going to apply some CA glue to the top of the point where that sits. This little tab is going to sit inside that reservoir. Now I found it easier to come in from the bottom and slot that into place, and then just press it down from the top. Now we have two more black pieces that get glued onto the chassis. I have no idea what these parts are either, but I do know that there are these two square nubs that stick out of the chassis, and then these parts on the bottom have a small square hole. That is the part that goes onto the nubs. We'll drop this other one in place the same way, and that takes care of that. Now by now you should have one large polycap left and 8 of the small ones. We need to put a polycap in the chassis, and the large one will fit in the opening we need to put it in, but it's not the right one. The large polycap goes for the fan in the back. We want to use one of the 8 small ones for this. Now, I'm not sure why they give us 8 small polycaps. I've gone through the instructions a couple of times. This is the only one we use. The engine covers can be posed either down or up, but they aren't hinged. They're 2 different interchangeable glass pieces, and depending on which one you use changes how the engine cover panel sits. Now there is this spine piece which you have to remove to gain access to the mount points. It has a pin that goes in this hole. The polycap is supposed to help hold the spine in place a little better, as this is not a snug fit. The Tamiya's instructions say to score the polycap. What they mean is they want you to cut it. So just cut through one side. Do not cut the polycap in half. Once the polycap is cut, we're going to very carefully drop it into this hole on the inside of the chassis. We're going to apply some Tamiya Extra Thin to the spine along the inside of the chassis. We're also going to add some to the base of this air plenum. Then we're going to drop the plenum into place, locking our polycap into position. Now when we drop the spine in place, it's still a little loose. I think once the rest of the car is in place underneath it, it lifts that spine up and holds it into its correct position so that it doesn't flop around. Next, we're going to drop our dashboard into the chassis, and it should sit right about like this. But for the moment, we're going to scoot this back just a little bit. We are going to run a bead of glue along this line. I got a little messy with it, but that's okay. It's not that important. Then we'll slide the dash into place and press it home so the glue can set. This is why I think leaving the outer part of the dash in black was a good call. I think that black helps to break up the carbon between the instrument binnacle and the outside of the car. I think the 2 separate sections of carbon have more pop than it being one big swath of carbon through there. Alright guys, so that is going to wrap it up for this video, and this is where we are with the build. We have our engine bay and our rear suspension completely finished, so the lower half of the chassis is done, and we have the upper half of the chassis complete as well. This is also the point where we are done with me having a plan for the videos. As you guys know, I like to build the videos in sections, paint the body, do the engine, build the interior, so the videos have a sort of a theme. But the instructions from this point on are just not conducive to that at all. From here, the instructions have us start on the glass in the middle, which is pretty cool how they did it. I do like how they did the glass. Then there's just a lot of work on the front of the body, then to the back of the body, then back to the front, and it's just a lot of back and forth all over the car. It's really kind of chaotic. So there's either going to be one big video that will be very long and will cover the entire rest of the 20 steps on this build, or more likely there's going to be about 2 more smaller videos in this build series, but I'm not really sure where I'm going to split them up. We'll just have to see how that goes. So I have rambled on for far too long now. Thanks guys for hanging out and building with me. I always appreciate you stopping by and watching, and I will catch you guys on the next one.